Last Friday, 2023 provided us with the revival of yet another band and another throwback to the early 2000s of the emo pop punk Mum Get Out My Room, It's Not Just a Phase scene. As Fall Out Boy have returned with their new album So Much for Stardust after their previous, shall we call it rather interesting and unflattering album, MANIA. Now, some of you may know there was a time in my mid-teens when Arctic Monkeys weren't my favourite band and Fall Out Boy were. In this previous video, I spoke about the downfall of Fall Out Boy and their somewhat hopeful redemption through the releases of their new singles Love From The Other Side and Heartbreak Feels So Good. Love From The Other Side really blew me away and got me hyped up for this album and a return to elements of their classic style of songwriting and production, especially as Fall Out Boy had teamed back up with Neil Avron, who produced Folie à Deux and also their original record label who released their debut album Take This To Your Grave. I was even more excited for the release after watching this interview with Zane Lowe where Patrick Stump and Pete Wentz described the relationship the two have when it comes to writing their music, reflecting Patrick Stump as a composer of Pete's writing. It gives a great insight into how they wrote their previous records and the approach to their new album, and how they aim to promote their original sound without trying to sound like a gimmick of their older days, staying away from the sound of old guys trying to relive their youth. So, through much anticipation, how did So Much for Stardust hold up? Well, let's get on with it then. Now, the first thing I'd say about this new record is that the drums are great and really come through with that heavy caveman energy that's great on albums that I love, such as Arctic Monkeys' debut or various Queens of the Stone Age records. Lyrically, the band are back at it again with that classic Fall Out Boy style of writing where Patrick is really refining Pete's words. Overall, the album takes new Fall Out Boy elements, classic Fall Out Boy elements, and smashes them together in a Fall Out Boy salsa. That sounds a bit like a rock opera in many regards. I've briefly mentioned the singles already, and the album kicks off with them both, starting with Love From The Other Side and moving into Heartbreak Feels So Good. I think Love From The Other Side really is a top-notch Fall Out Boy song. It incorporates grand-scale instruments with classic Fall Out Boy lyrics, great vocals, and some really great drumming. It's probably the band's best song since their Folie à Deux album, and I've been listening to it since it came out. Moving on, Hold Me Like a Grudge and Fake Out were pretty decent songs that ran coherently, following the stylistic rock opera take that the album was seeming to go with, and were ultimately pretty good listens. But they didn't blow me away in the same way that Love From The Other Side did. But despite that, I'd say of the two, I really did like Hold Me Like a Grudge, and I feel I could really picture this being performed live in the middle of a set as a good tempo keeper for the pacing of a gig. Heaven Iowa brought the pacing down a little with a more relaxed and emotionally led song. Also, I'm sure other people will have picked up on it, but the opening of the percussion sounds like the introduction of Sugar We're Going Down. And whilst I do say that this song is more relaxed, I mean that in an instrumental sense, as Patrick's voice is still loud, booming and reaching for those higher notes. So Good Right Now was a great tune from my perspective and provided the album the lift that it needed by the midpoint of the listening experience. The song does sound happy in its nature, but it's actually got quite pessimistic and cynical lyrics that contradict the happy tone of the song. And the Oh section of the song really throws me back to Young Volcanoes from Save Rock and Roll. I thought this song was a pretty decent highlight on the album, and it's ultimately going to end up on an advert, mark my words. I thought the introductory drums on Flu Game were pretty good and got me hyped for the rest of the song, but I felt that all of it didn't quite deliver on what the introduction had built up. Baby Annihilation, though not strictly a song, did fit great into the listening experience of the album, building up a great atmosphere that did feel reflective of the tone of the album, all spoken by Pete Wentz. What a Time to Be Alive was another song that fit coherently into the album, but once again didn't particularly blow me away. But it's still a decent Fall Out Boy song that trundles along with all the ingredients you'd expect from a Fall Out Boy song. That Through Shades reminded me a bit of $20 Nosebleed off Folie à Deux, that featured Brendan Urie. So Much for Stardust closes off the album as the title track, ending the album once again with this echoing rock operatic choir guitar bursting style that is featured heavily throughout the record. Usually I'm not too much of a sucker for the fading out of a song at the end of an album, but the way both Patrick's vocals and the backing choir were isolated and then faded out was great in my opinion. This provided a somewhat sinister and unsettling feeling of everything may have seemed great, but trust me, it's not all what it seemed. Most likely attempting to reflect the album's title of So Much for Stardust, pointing towards the more unwelcome take on the implications that come along with being famous and very successful. Overall, I think this album is what I'd call pretty decent. As I've stated before, I used to love Fall Out Boy and they were my favourite band at one point in time, so it was always really disappointing to see where they ended up by the time I listened to MANIA. And all I can say is that this album really did repair and rebuild a lot of the burnt bridges for me that their last few albums had done. So Much for Stardust did hit the spot, and although I'd agree it did become apparent the album gives strong rock opera vibes, it didn't quite fulfill its potential in that regard for me. Although, to be fair, I grew up listening to the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust, so maybe my standards for rock opera styled albums has always been a bit too high. But regardless of that whole conversation around rock opera, the album really did feel like a band reaching back to its roots and created a piece of work that didn't feel like a gimmick and combined elements of their new style whilst working in their original style that made us all fans in the first place. I think personally it's a great return album for them, and I completely welcome more Fall Out Boy albums done in such a style. When it comes to the pitfalls of the album, I think it comes in the form that there's maybe 4 to 5 songs that are just okay and enjoyable listens, but weren't songs that intrigued me enough, and dare I say it, maybe lacked a bit of imagination at times. I think it's fair enough to say that Love From The Other Side does really blow all the other songs out of the water on this album. And when you open up an album with your strongest song, it does mean that there is a slow decline throughout your listening experience, even despite all the other tunes on the record being up to a decent enough quality. I still believe though the album has enough good songs to keep it afloat. Overall, I think I'm feeling about a 7.3 out of 10 for the album. As I've said, I really enjoy parts of this album, but parts of it also do just float me by. Saying that, this is their return album after Mania, so I'm more relieved to say that this album is really worth your time and giving it a listen, especially if you're cautious about maybe returning to Fall Out Boy's work. I think this is potentially my favourite album since Folie à Dieu, but it might just be tied with Save Rock and Roll, as I did really enjoy that album as well. And realistically, I haven't had as much time to fully digest the new album to the same extent. So I'm not quite sure where I'd place it yet, but it's certainly going to get replayed a lot in the upcoming weeks, and I'll make my mind up then. But there we are, a good record and a strong return for Fall Out Boy. Good for you guys. As always, feel free to like and subscribe if you're new here, and on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.